Hello, everyone. My name is Miguel Myers. Welcome to my horror confessional, where every week I'll have a guest come on and talk about one classic horror movie that they haven't seen and why. We'll discuss the movie, the actors, and probably get off topic quite a bit. Once I believe that they have properly atoned, I will absolve them of their horror movie sin. Today we have R.A. Busby. R.A. is the author of Corporate Body, which book six of the My Dark Library series from Cemetery Gates. She is also the 2020 Shirley Jackson Award recipient for short fiction for her story, Not the Man I Married. She has a novella coming out in early 2024 from Cemetery Gates called Words Made Flesh. Nope, sorry, Words Made of Flesh, about a creepy book that binds with the life of whoever owns it. She also has the story 10,000 Crawling Children appearing soon in Nightmare Magazine. When she's not writing horror, RA can usually be found hiking in dark forests or running in the desert with her dog. RA, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. I have listened to your podcast, especially because you've touched upon movies that I've never really heard of in a lot of cases. And so it was a real pleasure to come in and see a classic like Shadow of the Vampire that had just sort of fallen below my radar. And so it was a genuine joy. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm so excited to have you. So I want to talk about a couple things here, but what's jumping out at me right now about your bio is the Shirley Jackson Award. So there's you don't know this, but I am currently obsessed. I'm currently obsessed with Shirley Jackson. I am in the throes of like devouring everything I can on her. I recently read her a book that came out obviously post posthumously called the Letters of Shirley Jackson, where it's just all of her letters that take her from like early 20s up until like 8 days before her death. She wrote to like her publicist and her family members, her mom and dad, and like friends and stuff like that. And then I've just been now I'm reading her bio, and I've just been so when you say like Shirley Jackson Award recipient, like that is amazing. That's such a big accomplishment. So congratulations on that.
It was an honor. She's one of my favorite authors as well.
You're right. Okay. Have you had the chance? I know it only came out within the last couple of years, but have you had a chance to read? I did the audiobook, but have you had a chance to read the letters of Shirley Jackson?
It's on my TBR, but the only reason that I really didn't immediately snap it up is I had just finished listening because I also do audiobooks a whole lot to the wonderful recent biography of Jackson, and I'm trying to pop it up literally on my audio
On
right
your
now to get
Libby?
well or on my Audible app to get the author's name and the title.
Ruth Franklin.
I think it was the Franklin. In fact, I'm almost certain you are correct. Yeah, I think you are. And it was wonderful because exploring the intersection of Jackson's life with her marriage and that terrible relationship with her mother and her kids and looking at how that penetrated in and throughout her fiction was just amazing.
Yeah, it's and I haven't read all of her books. I've only read maybe three or four plus a bunch of short stories, but I want to. But knowing that, I mean, the name of the biography is like A Haunted Life, right? And it's truly like moving what she went through. Oh man, I can have a whole podcast on her, and we can actually talk about this in the Patreon exclusive post show if you'd like. That's called I always forget the name of the damn show, Sunday School Sessions. We can talk about that later, but yeah, I'm obsessed with her, everything Shirley Jackson. So when I saw that, I was so glad to see that. One, so the story that you won it for, Not the Man I Married, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm assuming it's kind of in a similar vein to her writing. Is that what comes with like? Is that what they're looking for like a Shirley Jackson Award?
I can't say. I'm just glad that mine landed.
Okay.
One of the things that I think as an author I respond to a great deal, and I think I had in that story, so maybe this was the connection for the Shirley Jackson folks, is that she is so keenly aware of, how do I put this, the stifling claustrophobia of other people, especially people that are related to her by family or by family ties or by social connections and social pressures, and that claustrophobia in many ways permeates, I think, so much of her work. Those uncomfortable social interactions that she has, where so much of the life that's lived by the protagonists is just totally internal. And I hope to capture that in the story that I wrote, which is literally about a woman who um, is just sitting there eating dinner with her daughter when her spouse comes in, and she thinks to herself that it's not really him, it's not really Charles, it's someone who looks exactly like Charles, somebody who has Charles's face, has Charles's attitude, but it's not really him. And um, and it she goes the rest of the story trying to think, is this a trick? Is this a trap? And he's not the nicest person. He's quite clearly very, very dominant. And then darker things about him are revealed as the story progresses.
Okay, that sounds yeah, that sounds like in a similar vein to like Shirley Jackson's what she writes, and also her real life, which is terrible. I mean, the quote unquote open relationship that she had with her husband Stanley Hyman, it's very frustrating. And you know what's even more frustrating is listening to the letters that she wrote, and like seeing a bit of myself in her husband, and
Mm,
like
mm.
and dealing with my wife, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm a like I've had conversations with my wife in the last like 2 3 weeks. I'm like, I am so sorry for like if I am in any way similar to Stanley or anything like that. She's like, you are not Stan. What are you doing? I'm like, okay.
Oh,
I'm just like, again, I can go through, but I would recommend to you. It sounds like you're on your to be read list, but to the audience, if you have not read that her book, Letters of Shirley Jackson, and also her biography, definitely do. She's just one of our like greatest American authors, one of the greatest authors, and just like I love that she is getting the recognition that she didn't get when she was like during her time, you know.
and her work is such a master class in amazing writing. I mean, with all due respect to Stephen King and his hatred of adverbs, um, the opening of Hill House, which uses those modifiers so brilliantly, is just this beautiful study of how to make that opening paragraph, and especially setting, just sing. um, and the same thing is true with character voice in the beginning of They've Always Lived in the Castle. I mean, can you get a better opening than those first couple of sentences?
Yeah, and I recently that's the one I've mostly recently read is We've Always Lived in the Castle, and I had seen the movie maybe a couple months ago, whatever. I didn't realize it was a Shirley Jackson movie because I just never heard of it. But then I was reading the book, and I was like, oh man, this is way better than movie. It's just the character of is it Mary
Mary Cat.
Cat? Mary Cat, yeah, and her sister. It's like just beautiful. Yeah, seriously, she is. I read Shirley Jackson before. Like I read it in school, and then afterwards, like I read The Lottery and all, but I never, I never dove into it. And now I'm in the middle of that, and I'm just like, it's affected my whole life. My wife is like, I do not want to hear about Shirley Jackson anymore for the next day. I'm like, okay, understand. But so I apologize that I couldn't talk to her about it, so I'm talking to you about her. But let's focus on you now. So you also have a novella coming out in early 2024 called Words Made of Flesh from Cemetery Gates. Could you tell me a bit about that?
Absolutely. It really came out as part of my love for those stories that tend to be set in that scenario that became really famous in James's Turn of the Screw. A bunch of people sitting around in one of those dark old libraries telling ghost stories to each other. And I sort of encountered it backwards, where from Stephen King's story, The Breathing Method, in different seasons, and then in Peter Straub's Ghost Story, and then finally all the way back to the original um, Henry James' Turn of the Screw. And I love that setup because it's so much about bookishness and the way in which books are speaking to each other and people are telling those stories in this place of books and of book lovers. And I have a number of friends in the SCA, the Society for Creative Anachronism, and through them I learned a lot about just the procedure by which medieval texts were made through, taking skin, turning it into parchment, how to prepare parchment, and the physicality of these books was fascinating. And when I started doing some just preliminary reading, I ran into the horrible but real life phenomenon of there being books that are literally bound in skin from people. And I thought, that's horrifying. And then it just sort of went on from there. Like, what if the book itself were a kind of a living organism, a kind of a living entity? Not quite sentient, but also still powerful in kind of a talismanic or um, kind of a way.
Hmm.
And that's really what inspired the book overall.
That sounds really fascinating. That sounds really interesting. Um, so, in the book Words Made of Flesh, uh, it says here that the book binds with the life of whoever owns it. So, is that like, is it something like the Necronomicon, where the book actually, like, I mean, is anthropomorphized a bit, or is it more ethereal than that? Or, and if you don't, if that's like, if you don't want to reveal too much, that's fine. I'm just like kind of like fascinated by the idea.
I had, and again, in doing research and looking up, that books, that weird books, essentially. Obviously, Lovecraft's Necronomicon was first on the list, and of course, the texts that he's basing the Necronomicon are on, some of these texts from, like the Voynich manuscript, or other of these books from especially the Middle Ages, and the early Elizabethan period, and even in ancient times before. The books in those real life books in many ways seem to have this kind of semi-sentient relationship with the person who speaks them. And um, the word itself is a kind of a magic thing in those books, that if you mispronounce it, I mean, we saw that like with Harry Potter in a different context, where it's Wingardium Leviosa, as opposed to
Yeah,
Leviosa.
right.
And, and so the pronunciation and the spelling and the orthography of a word is part and parcel of its magic. And certainly drawing from Jewish tradition, the word in the script that's in the mezuzah, the little box that's on the doorways of religious Jewish families. The crafting of the mezuzah, because it contains the name of God, is sacred. And if you make a mistake, and I've done enough calligraphy to know that mistakes are part and parcel of what you do, you can't just crumple it up and throw it away, because that's crumpling up and throwing away the name of God. It's got a thingness that um, that we're not yet necessarily used to thinking of in terms of words. I think partly because we pulled away from the physicality of words by having by having words on Kindle or on an app, which I do too, as opposed to on a manuscript that you labored over in a medieval scriptorium.
Right. And then we also have like the Klaatu Brada Nikto, which is what is said in Army of Dead that messes them all up. So I completely understand like the power of the words. So I want to get into a bit of your background. So what is your history with horror movies or horror literature in general? Is it something that you loved since a child? Is something like your family uh, had as well, or is that something you came across by on your own, that sort of thing?
I'd say, like a lot of people, I mean, I'm going to be super original here and say that I really loved it ever since fairy tales. I mean, some of the most horrifying fairy tales that are out there, especially like Hansel and Gretel. I mean, if you really think about how horrible that is, um, it and kids do, because they don't, they don't have sort of this, oh, it's Disney, oh, it's fluffy filters. No, they're like, no, that witch is going to pop you in the oven and you're going to be dinner. And I think that without filters, that childhood experience with things like fairy tales really hits at a deep place. And certainly family trauma helps. And and then later on, of course, uh, I remember being scared to death by Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, especially the very first one, where and in that story, this guy who's gone to a wizarding school is trying to show off, but he's kind of like somebody who's got like a little bit of weapons training or a little bit of martial arts training or a little bit of driver's ed, and then decides that he's going to go 200 miles an hour, and he calls forth the spirit of the dead, and it opens up a hole between this realm and the shadow realm, and lets out a shadow beast that pursues him for the rest of the novel. And that scared me to death because it was so indeterminate. It didn't have it was literally a shadow, and it pursued him everywhere like one shadow does.
And
And
I'm sorry to interrupt you. How old were you like in when you were reading this Ursula K. Le Guin?
I'd have to
Is this like
say
preteen or?
I'd have to say probably 11 or 12, and then earlier even Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time was
Hmm.
also terrifying, which I read when I think I was about 7 or 8. Um,
Okay.
because of that, and the scene in Camazotz especially, where they're all doing exactly the same thing at the same time, and there's this sort of faceless, um, emotionless, robotic quality to them and to the entity behind them, the creature called it.
Uh,
So both of them have a lot to do with shaping me as a writer.
So, Ursula K. Le Guin was also one of those authors who I've read some of her short stories and I really enjoyed, but I have a couple of her books that I purchased in the hopes of reading them one day. But I know that if I go down like that path, I'm going to like what's happening with Shirley Jackson right now. I'm going to become obsessed. I probably the same thing's going to happen with her. But from what I've read of her short stories, she's really, really good.
She really is, and I cannot recommend the Earthsea trilogy highly enough, um, because they immediately plunge you into this sort of world of the archetypal, and with such an economy of prose. I mean, the book will feel bigger than it is. It's kind of like a TARDIS book, as it were. It's bigger on the inside.
Nice. Okay, and so it sounds like you've enjoyed it since a child with the literature. How about movies? Has like horror movies been, because there are some people who just kind of mess with the literary side of horror, books, and really don't watch a lot of movies. Was that your experience as well, or did you also get into horror movies?
Oh, I'd say I double dipped with literature and with film.
Nice.
Um, I mean, I grew up with the Twilight Zone, and that was part and parcel of just like watching TV. And yeah, I know that that's not exactly a horror movie, but it's absolutely horror adjacent
Oh
with the
yeah.
spec. Creeps me out, man. And some of the and just the punchiness of some of those episodes are again it's masterful how well it's done. And then I remember also being about like, ooh, I was a kid. I really, yeah, I was a kid at this time, but passing by and seeing the photograph of Sissy Spacek, drenched in blood in her prom dress with her big blue eyes staring out with this look of utter just transformative shock. And
Yeah.
I knew that that was not a book that my mom would necessarily be super happy if I read. So of course I bought it and sneaked it home. And then as soon as I could watch that movie because I felt and this is disturbing. And you know, if you're a 12-year-old kid and you're thinking, wow, I really feel such a connection to Carrie, that's kind of a problem. but but I did, and that sort of led me to watching of course like The Shining, and then those great slasher films from the 80s,
80s.
Friday the 13th and Halloween, those ones. And then it sort of went then for me anyway, horror sort of dipped down below the horizon and then sort of had a resurgence. Again, for me personally, oh I'd say um, probably within the last 10, 15 years where you all of a sudden get these amazing movies that are doing new and different things with the genre,
Mm.
especially Hereditary, which Midsummer and The Lighthouse, um, and that gets you to go back to some of these neglected classics like Shadow of the Vampire, for example, and you realize, oh, okay, there's great things that I've just plain missed. So it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah, when you said Lighthouse, I was like, yeah, speaking of Lighthouse, we got our boy Willem Dafoe from this movie, who's also obviously in the Lighthouse. So okay, so let's that's a bit of your background. So let's talk about the movie that you came here to confess your sin of never having watched, which obviously was Shadow of the Vampire. So, and Shadow of the Vampire from 2000. So I always think, because the rule here is that the movie has to always be at least 20 years old. And so when I was like adding, I have a big list I keep on Letterboxd of movies that are eligible. And then when I came across Shadow of the Vampire, I'm like, no, that's not eligible yet. And I was like, oh wait, that came out in 2000. That is sad, but it is also happy that it's completely eligible for it. So Shadow of the Vampire from 2000. So why had you never watched this particular movie? Is it never heard of it, or just was on the list but never got to it?
But yeah, it dropped off my radar, which was a real shame because I mean, you got these two amazing powerhouse actors with John Malkovich and Willem Dafoe, and it seems to be really super hard to access through streaming. And I went ahead and just got the video because it's like, oh, I know I'm going to want to see this more than once because this looks fantastic, and I was not disappointed. It's an amazing film.
That's great
It
to hear. Yeah,
deserves.
yeah, this is definitely, it's not on streaming anywhere, and it's very hard to find a DVD copy of it. I'm glad you did. I ended up watching it on more nefarious means, in which the studio was not paid. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And I will link the movie in I have a Discord for my horror confessional, so I will link the movie in the Discord so that you guys can watch it if you haven't seen it yet. But okay, so that's why you hadn't seen Shadow of the Vampire yet. So let's go ahead and get started talking about it. So Shadow of the Vampire from 2000, directed by E. Elias Merhig. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Can you say that again?
I think it's Marriage because I listened to the DVD commentary,
Okay.
and it's like, oh, that's how you say it. Oh, okay.
Okay. And he really only directed Shadow of the Vampire and then another movie called Suspect Zero. And then besides that, he did some shorts and that's it. And that's really, I don't understand because this movie was really well directed. And I don't understand why he wasn't given a chance for other things. Like maybe, between Shadow of a Vampire and Suspect Zero was a long time. So it's just kind of disappointing that we didn't see more from this director. But so written by Stephen Katz, who also didn't have a lot of credits in film. He did Wind Chill. It came out 2007. That's another horror movie which I haven't seen, but I'm definitely interested in checking out. But as far as TV is concerned, he wrote on The Nick and Manhunt. And then it stars John Malkovich, like you were saying earlier, who plays Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, or F.W. Murnau, the famous film director. John Malkovich was also obviously famously from being John Malkovich, but also known as Cyrus the Virus from Con Air. So if you know, you know. And then we have Willem Dafoe, who is in this movie plays Max Schreck, also Nosferatu. It's a bit meta. Obviously, we all know Willem Dafoe and his work, but he was Green Goblin from the OG Spider-Man. He was actually hired as the Green Goblin after the producers watched his performance in this movie. So I love that. And then obviously The Lighthouse. And if you haven't seen this one, definitely recommend for everybody the Streets of Fire from 1984. It's not a horror movie. It's more like a rock and roll glam opera / musical. It meets the Warriors, but it's so fucking good. And he has an outfit in that movie that is just, it's like a fisherman's what's that called? Fisherman's like overalls, right? But black leather and no shirt underneath, no top. So it's amazing. And The Hunger, obviously from 1983, where he plays another vampire in that one. That
Yeah.
another great movie. And then Udo Kier, I believe that's how you say that one, who plays Albin Grau. He's this character actor. You kind of know him from everything, but you don't ever remember his name. But I remember him as Dragonetti from Blade with Wesley Snipes.
Okay.
He literally played Count Dracula in Blood for Dracula from 1974. And then most famously as an uncredited party guest in Eve and Gwen Stefani's video for Let Me Blow Your Mind, which of course everybody knows.
Okay.
It's not. I saw that on his credits and I was like, okay, I got to add that because that's the most ridiculous thing. For some reason, Udo Kier has been in a ton of music videos. Like, I don't know why. But then, of course, everybody's favorite, Cary Elwes. He plays Fritz Arno Wagner. Of course, we know him from Saw, The Princess Bride, Robin Hood Men in Tights, and then also Bram Stoker's Dracula. He's in that one as well. And then Eddie Izzard plays Gustav von Wagenheim, who I know him as a stand-up comedian. I never watched any of his work, but he's a pretty famous stand-up comedian. He was also in Ocean's 13, Mystery Man, and Across the Universe. And then last but not least, Catherine McCormick. She played Greta Schroeder. She was in 28 Weeks Later, Braveheart, and Spy Game. So that's kind of the cast and crew of Shadow of the Vampire. I mean, this is a pretty straightforward movie as far as what it's about. The summary of it, it's a fictionalized account of the making of F.W. Murnau's classic movie Nosferatu from 1922, in which it is said that perhaps the star of the movie, Max Schreck, was in fact a vampire, and then everything that would come out of if that were to be true. So it's kind of like an alternative history of an actual event that took place, which is like this movie being made. So it's a very meta movie, right? And so the movie starts off and it's got like this Art Deco style opening, which I kind of love. Like it's like the 20s and 30s, like you see, like very metropolis kind of. And it feel like the art is trying to tell me something, but I don't know what it is. Because you see a lot of times, even like you had mentioned earlier, like Midsommar. In Midsommar, you see like this beautiful painting on a cloth or whatever, and it's kind of telling you the story. And I feel like that's what they were doing here, but I couldn't figure out what it was trying to tell me. So I'm very interested in kind of going back after having seen this movie again, going back and trying to see if I can figure out what it was trying to tell me in that. And then we do see it does have the silent film interstitials kind of thing where it kind of tells you what's going on at a time period, which I love. Have you seen any silent films?
Well, as a result of choosing this one, I went back and watched the whole Nosferatu,
Excellent.
because
Okay.
you really have to. You really have to, and I mean, because it's so baked in, and like almost every horror fan, I'd seen the famous shots, like the hand claw and Count Orlok rising up out of the coffin and on the ship, but I hadn't ever seen the whole thing, all the way through. And it was a revelation. It really was, especially then going and seeing Shadow of the Vampire and realizing how amazingly carefully crafted this movie was in talking back and forth to Murnau's original.
Right. And Defoe did such an excellent job with the mannerisms of Max Schreck as Nosferatu. Like he copied them really, really well, and just like his facial expressions and all that. I mean, this movie, the role was written specifically for him. I don't know if this movie is as successful in doing what it's trying to do without Willem Dafoe. I mean,
Oh no, I can't
uh,
think of anybody.
I mean, John Malkovich was certainly a great F.W. Burnell, and he's a great actor. But I think another actor could have taken that role, whereas no other actor could have been Max Schreck, other than Willem Dafoe. Did you watch Nosferatu before watching this movie, or did you watch it afterwards?
I
Just
watched it
curious.
before
Oh,
because I kind
really
of wanted,
interesting. Okay.
and I never. And again, it's funny sort of the audience, the way that the film crafts its audience as well, and what it expects from the audience, and because the pacing and timing are very different from a film that we would watch now. But it was fascinating how absorbing it was and how well it makes use of its time. And especially with Max Schreck, it is genuinely creepy. Not in a jump scary kind of way, but it is creepy. I can see why somebody would come up with that original plot idea for Shadow of the Vampire. Like maybe this guy really is the real thing.
Yeah,
So,
it looks very creepy. What's funny is if you kind of know a little bit about, if one knows a little bit about silent films and how they were filmed, and then were to watch Shadow of the Vampire, you'd be like, wait, that's bullshit. Like immediately, which I understand comedic license and all that sort of stuff. I mean, movie license and all that sort of stuff. But like, for example, like filming at night was impossible to do in 1922. So all nighttime scenes were actually filmed in the day, and they were tinted blue to differentiate them between the scenes that take place during the day. So when you're watching Nosferatu and you see the film, the scenes that are shot at night, it's really just tinted blue and they're shot during the day. But that would completely wipe out the whole plot for this movie, right? So it's
yeah.
kind of like, if you know a bit about it, you're like, well, that's obviously bullshit. But also vampires are bullshit. So, quit your bullshit sort of thing. But yeah, I'm really happy that you saw Nosferatu. I have seen Nosferatu in the past. I didn't have time to check it out for this movie, but I know that movie is so affecting, and I love silent horror films, specifically like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which we've covered in the past. Is really great. Instead, that German expressionistic sort of thing, like absolutely love it. So I love that we get a bit of a callback to silent films in the opening of this movie.
I was going to say I love I mean, in the original, as I know they've got that iris camera and right after that, that sort of Art Deco theater curtain opens and sort of admits us, that very first thing that we see is this eye, this eye, is Murnau's eye, and then the camera eye, and
Mm.
then that iris lens opening up into the picture that they're filming. And so we've got these sort of layers of filmic eyes, and it's using that silent film technique of this iris filming to bring us in, which I thought was amazing and cool.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things I failed to mention about this movie and actually about Nosferatu was that Nosferatu was an unauthorized retelling of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and they actually talk about it a bit in this movie here, where F.W. Murnau wanted to make Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, but Bram's or Stoker's family, what's it called? Family's estate refused to sell them the rights. So they're like, oh, we'll make it anyway, but change the names. And so they did that. And then the Stoker estate sued them and won. And every single copy was to be destroyed. But obviously a couple of copies existed. And that's the only, or survived. And that's the only reason why we're able to watch this movie, or not this movie, but we're able to watch Nosferatu now, is because a couple people didn't destroy those copies as they were supposed to. And like, thank God for that, right? Because imagine not and that was a fate for a lot of silent films. A lot of even films that Murnau himself directed are just gone because they just weren't saved, so imagine like having lost Nosferatu. That'd be really, really bad. But so moving back to Shadow of the Vampire, this movie is a bit meta because you got to kind of walk in between talking about Shadow of the Vampire and talking about Nosferatu, but I love it. But the movie starts off and Murnau is talking to Greta Schroeder, who played by Catherine McCormick, and he's like giving her directions. And I'd hate to be like a silent actor with the like director just saying weird things to you, and you have to kind of like play off of that. That's really
It's
weird.
I was fascinated by that interaction because, as I mean, in doing in working with theater folks, that's kind of how directors and during rehearsal are talking to their actors. But usually, as soon as the actor starts talking, the director stops talking. And so, because of the silent film, we've just got Murnau's uh, direction literally happening as they're acting, and they're supposed to act, and they are supposed to listen to him, but be pretending that they're not listening. And I thought that, yeah, that's a very different sort of filmic world than the one that we're really used to.
Yeah, and it's actually this movie is actually like a really good representation of the art of movie making as it was at the turn of century, right, or the turn of the 20th century, right? So it's just really interesting. So it's not only it's like a period piece, but it's also like a behind the scenes movie, and it's campy and it's gory and it's funny. It's just so much rolled up into one movie now. It's really I'm really, really happy you chose this one. Another thing that they have is that they're all wearing lab coats and they all like kind of look like scientists, which I love because this when film was first developing. Thank you. Um, as a art form, it was treated as a science, and a lot of the first directors were scientists, and I love that we get to see that here. Did you
I think the note that I wrote,
sorry, good.
I was going to say, I think the note that I wrote was fabulous steampunk look here, with the goggles and the glasses and the whole, sort of mad doctor aesthetic that we're getting here. And I think that mad doctor proved to be more thematically important than I initially would have thought at first, but it really was.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's kind of like a very it's a portent of things to come. So they're filming this scene for the movie, and then they finish all the interior shots, and Murnau is very happy to be done with the interior shots, and now they're going to be going to on location. And so he kind of like packs everything up, and we find out that Murnau is being very secretive about, you know, the location of where they're going to be and who is going to be playing Nosferatu, all that sort of stuff. His producers want to know, his cameramen want to know, and he's just being very hush hush about it. And so the scene, they finish shooting that scene, and then we get a scene of Murnau. He's like in a brothel or a I can't forget. I forget the name of the what I'm trying to say, but basically he
Cabaret?
in a where, I'm sorry.
Cabaret?
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Thank you very much. He's like in a cabaret, and then we see him like biting a woman's ass. It's like a very quick scene to kind of just like show him outside of him being a director. But it was like a very quick 10-second scene. But this scene was actually a subplot that they removed from the movie. And it was supposed to involve, so that performer, that cabaret performer, her name was Micheline, and it was going to be revealed that she gave him the book where it kind of talks about certain people who could be vampires, and then he goes looking for shooting locations for this movie, and that's where he stumbled across Max Schreck. Well, she's the one who gave him that book, and then Max talks about how he became a vampire, when he's getting drunk later in the movie, and he talks about a woman that he met, and it was supposed to be that woman, Micheline. So it's supposed to be the same woman. And I thought that would have been a great subplot, and I don't know why they took it out. I thought that would have been really great.
Maybe just for time, possibly.
Well, I thought this movie was going to be 2 hours long, and it was only an hour and a half, which I loved. I love to see an hour and a half long movie. But this is one of those movies where I would have been fine if they did a bit more, That's just
There's so much.
my feeling on it.
Yeah, I love that callback to the old like cabaret vibes and that pre-World War II sort of pocket of like decadence and indulgence and sexuality that was sort of part of that. In between the two war period, before, of course, obviously everything erupted into fascism. But I thought that was perfect for getting that sense of where Murnau was, that this is who he really is.
Right. And we're going to see something later on in the movie that kind of like helps reveal a bit more about him, because we don't really get too much. We don't get a lot of background for pretty much anybody in this movie. So it's nice when we do get a bit. But so they're traveling by train to this location in Eastern Europe, and I believe it's Czechoslovakia. And so everybody's kind of in the dark as far as what's happening. But at this point, everybody arrives in Transylvania, or sorry, Czechoslovakia. And then at one point, Murnau says, "We are scientists engaged in the creation of memory." And so I liked it because one of my questions was at the beginning of this was like, do they see themselves as scientists? And they, in fact, do see themselves as scientists. And so, and then they're sitting around in a tavern, kind of drinking. And the next day is when they're going to start filming. And one of the people is like, well, Friedrich, F.W. Murnau, like, where are the rest of the actors? And he says, those are the actors right there. And it's just the townspeople. And they say, well, they're not actors. And he says, well, they don't need to act. They just need to be. And so it's kind of already it gives you a inkling of what he's going for. He's going for realism here because he has, Max Schreck in his back pocket, he thinks anyway. Right. So then it's later at night, and we see in the shadows, we see the iconic walk of what we now know as Nosferatu, but in the movie it's Max Shrek. But we see this iconic walk of Max Shrek with the stiff hands like on his sides, and we see this like organ music, or we hear, I'm sorry, we hear this organ music, and it looks fantastic. And he's like been left, somebody has left a rat for him to feed on, and so he grabs this like container with this rat in there. And then we at one point throughout this, actually throughout this movie, they take cuts of the original movie and just splice it in real quick. It'll be like a second or two. So at this particular time, we see a cut of the original movie of Max as Nosferatu, as the carriage driver in actually the original Nosferatu. So it's just kind of great that they cut that in there, because it actually looks like in place. Like it doesn't, you wouldn't think it's actually from the original film, but it is. So
I was so impressed throughout by the nearly seamless intertwining of the original footage with the modern footage. I mean, because I'd seen Nosferatu like the day before or so, a lot of it was familiar to me. Like, hey, whoa, I get, yeah, that's from the original. And I was incredibly impressed by just the seamlessness of that integration. Plus things like the costume design on like Susie Izard, where she's playing Gustav von Wagenheim, but also the Hutter, Jonathan Harker character, and looks just about identical to von Wagenheim. And I mean, just the love of the detail really comes through in pretty much every single frame of this movie.
oh yeah, yeah, they definitely took their time and made sure that things lined up. There's even a part later on in the movie where is it Greta? Yeah, where Greta, at the very end scene where Greta sees that he's not Max isn't casting a reflection in the mirror. And then we see in the movie that he's not casting a reflection in the mirror. Then there's a cut and they go back, and for like a split second or two, we actually see Willem Dafoe as Max Shrek in the mirror. So you think, oh, that's or not an anachronism, that's a mistake. But that
Right.
mistake actually happens in Nosferatu, the movie, as well.
Really, that's a good catch. I had not caught that.
Yes.
The original in the film.
Yeah, so even down to the errors that were made in Nosferatu from 1922, they replicated in this movie, which I just thought it was great.
Well, what's funny is that because I watched this movie twice, and the first time I was sitting in my car trying to think about sort of how to think about this movie, because what was having at this point dived down a number of internet rabbit holes reading about it. One of the things that came up persistently was that the F.W. Murnau, played by John Malkovich, was nothing like the actual F.W. Murnau, who was actually a really nice guy. He wasn't like this dictatorial, everything exists only for the film, and to heck with all of you, you pesky actors. Which is more like a Stanley Kubrick sort of attitude,
Right.
Bertolucci attitude, rather than actual Murnau. And I couldn't really understand how they could be so carefully faithful to the film, even down to what you're pointing out right now, where they even include a film gaffe, and yet kind of disregard real history. And I think honestly, I think it sort of hit me as I was driving. It's all in that final, like, sort of big thematic line that everybody quotes at the end of the film. And I guess John Malkovich actually wrote that line, which I think is 100% perfect, where he says, "If it isn't in the frame, it doesn't exist." So what they're really concerned with is it doesn't matter if real Murnau was this really nice guy. If it isn't in the frame, it doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and play with it.
Yeah, that's a great line, and that's a line that from what I read, I believe Murnau used. I don't know if it was exactly that line, but he used a variation of that line with throughout his life, and he actually told it to
Um,
an up and coming director that he worked with called Alfred Hitchcock, and then Alfred Hitchcock went on to use that line for the rest of his career. Um, Maybe not as literal as Murnau does in this movie, but yeah, it's great to see like the lineage, right, of directors and like the art form, right, from F.W. Murnau to Alfred Hitchcock to everything past that. But they have a certain, so it's just great to see that they have that like continued legacy or lineage. So, and then to your point about like the yin and yang of this movie, about them being so faithful to some parts and obviously not faithful to other parts, like all the people that were quote unquote killed in this movie actually went on to to lead like lives after the making of Nosferatu, and were in the industry for many years after that. I mean, the movie was actually, it's based in part on a legend that Max Schreck was in reality a vampire, which is why he played the role of Orlok so well. Um, some variations of the legend suggest that Nosferatu was the only film that Max Schreck made, though in reality he was already a stage and screen veteran by the time Nosferatu was shot, and he made many movies before and after Nosferatu came out. So it's like they're so faithful in some parts, and then in other parts it's like, well, no, we need the story is the thing, right? So they just went with that.
it's just brilliantly done, and I
Yeah,
love the what you call the meta-ness of it before, where you've got Willem Dafoe, an actor who's playing who's playing a vampire, who's playing an actor who's playing a vampire,
right.
and it's the sort of like layers of the onion going on, and then of course you've got real history.
Well, the funny thing about it is that there's actually a meme from after this movie came out. It's like, well, it's really funny that Defoe would play a, a vampire in this movie who's playing a man, because Defoe is actually a vampire in real life. So the meta-ness just keeps going, right? It just keeps going and going and going. So now
That's
23 years later, they need to make a making of Shadow of a Vampire in which Defoe is actually really a vampire and kills people on the set of Shadow the Vampire, and it just keeps
okay.
going.
I
And
love that.
you know what's funny is that Defoe is such an out there kind of character that I'm sure with the right script and the right director and the studio behind them, he would make that movie. You know?
I love this idea. I love this
Yeah.
idea, and we've got to get Robert Pattinson from The Lighthouse in there somewhere,
So
sparkling.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so back to the movie. At this point, they're now shooting at night, and this is the first time that anybody is seeing Shrek as Nosferatu, Max Shrek as Nosferatu, and it is absolutely terrifying. He does the whole like just the look. You said it before, but we didn't even discuss the look of Willem Dafoe as Max Shrek as Nosferatu. Is just amazing. Like he even does this thing with his fingers where he clacks his nails throughout the movie. It's so creepy. But he does this thing where like in order to open a door, he puts both hands first and then pulls the door towards him. Like nobody in the history of the world has ever opened a door like that, but it works here. And Nosferatu, and it happens in Nosferatu, the actual movie itself. But it's just funny. I love the way they do that. But so everybody's getting to meet Max Shrek for the first time, and I myself would be so scared to having meeting the actor, that having never met the actor before, but meeting him in a dark cave and in the middle of the night, and he's just in the background. And the actor was terrified. And so you hear like these directions from Murnau telling I'm forgetting the actor's name. It
And
is,
he's but also Susie.
yes, Gustav Wangenheim, right? Yeah,
Von Goggenheim.
yeah, Wangenheim. He's like, Murnau is directing him, and like at the end of the scene, Murnau's like, "Oh, you acted beautifully. You looked terrified," and he's like, "Oh yeah. I did great acting, right?" He was just extremely terrified, which is 100% accurate.
And I love that tension between, the sort of between realism and acting, and that method acting, and this sort of really over the top, stagey. What reads to a modern audience is stagey acting, in that style of filmmaking at the time. Like when we see the Jonathan Harker character get up, I mean, he's got a big stretch, and these movements are very exaggerated. And so these moments where the actors are genuinely scared, um, I think really stand out, and are really punchy because he is scary. It's a horrifying performance.
Yeah. And then so somebody asks Murnau, where did you find him really? And he's been telling them that he's part of this theater company, some random theater company that nobody's ever heard of, or he's trying to get away with just like kind of making up this person. And um, they ask him, "Where'd you find him really?" And then he says, "In that hole." So he's kind of telling the truth, but he's not giving the full truth. And so later on, they're back in they're filming another scene, and um, somebody's like praising Max's work. They call him like he's a very unconventional, and then we kind of get like the first of Max Schreck's like kind of shrugs, which I love because this movie is terrifying, but it's also it has its funny moments and it's very campy. So like it's like horror comedy camp, and you wouldn't think that would work, but it works beautifully. It works so good. But I love the little shrug. And then later on in the same scene, the makeup artist is like going to go put some makeup on on Shrek, and Murnau's like, no makeup. And then
Don't do the makeup.
later on at the table, he's like, I'd like some makeup. I was cracking up. Like,
Well, what I think is funny too about those interchanges between him and Murnau is that that is Count Orlok, starts doing the actor thing where he's gonna like make actory demands about, maybe we should fire the writers. And I was, obviously this is in the middle of the SAG actor strike, and I'm thinking, yep, there you go. Um, and Murnau grudgingly has to admit that no, we need the actors, but he's making all these sort of diva star demands about, I don't want any scenes on this ship. I don't like that. And that I think it was hysterical and timely, unintentionally so, but perfect, because I think it does flicker between camp and horror and comedy, and with those great disturbing implications that horror comedy will often give you.
yeah, I love it's like a meta, like again, a commentary on so many things, but it's also a commentary, like you're saying, on the making of a film, behind the scenes, the actors, how they act sometimes, and the directors, their demands, all that sort of stuff. It's just great. Um, and then again, at this point, Murnau is um, directing Max Schreck to kind of like with the directions that he was giving earlier in the movie we saw to his directors, and he's kind of giving him his motivation, that sort of thing. And then he asks him, what's something that is unattainable to
Mm.
you? And Max's response is the light of the sun.
Wow.
And that's like in the middle of this kind of camp funny sort of thing, you get this like touching commentary, and you're like, oh, this person used to be human, he's a tragic figure. And
And
because he's human, sorry to interrupt you, I was just saying, because he's human, he has a bit of an ego still, so when he asks for makeup, you understand it, but it just plays so well. But you were gonna say?
I was going to say that one of the reasons why I totally agree with you that nobody else but Willem Dafoe could have done this is that there's this beautiful moment later in the film where Udo and is getting drunk with somebody else, and they're kind of three sheets to the wind when Orlok shows up, and they get into talking about Orlok's having read the novel Dracula, and then uh, feeling really sorry that the guy doesn't have any servants after 400 years, and he says how it's so difficult to remember even the basics of being human, buying bread, buying cheese, setting the table, and remembering how to do these fundamental, basic human gestures of hospitality, um, because it's just probably been centuries since you had to be a human.
That scene was absolutely amazing. That was a great scene. And I failed to mention that Willem Dafoe was nominated for an Oscar for his role in this in this movie. He didn't win for it, but he was, I think, still to this day, the only actor to be nominated for an Oscar for having played a vampire, which is pretty great. But that just goes to tell you that horror in general isn't very well respected when it comes to the Oscars. And so something like the Silence of the Lambs isn't labeled a horror; it's labeled a thriller or something like that.
Mm.
But we know that it's a horror movie, but they don't want to give a horror movie the Oscar, so they do that a lot. But for the Oscars to notice and give respect to Willem Dafoe in this role just goes to show what a great job he did in this movie. And that
Incredible.
scene in particular you're talking about is amazing. Yeah.
Well, he really touches upon the pathos there, that and in that moment we do pity him because he's lost that touch of humanity. And ironically, this film, which is about an inhuman creature, is giving him back that little bit of humanity, that engagement with other people that he hasn't had for hundreds of years, and we feel sorry for him, and it's preserving it's awakening those memories of what it felt like to be human, um, and and I think that he makes us feel the both the realism and the pathos and the humor of that scene, and it's a great balancing act. I think he deserved the nomination. And
Yeah.
I actually think he deserved the pretty gold statue.
So back to the movie there. There's this one shot. So he quite literally lives in a cave. And so we kind of see these shots of him in the cave, just chilling or whatever. And there's an amazing shot of Max, and he's reading something, but there's this beautiful background behind him in his cave. And it's just a beautiful shot. And the cinematography, I mean, we haven't even talked about the cinematography of the movie, but it's just shot wonderfully. And it's like the composition of the shot with him right in the middle in the background. It's like I just love that particular shot. But while he's there, somebody, we don't actually know who at this point yet, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but brings him a bottle of blood. And so now part of the tension that was happening in the movie, if you didn't know it, like if you hadn't already seen this movie, is he or is he not a vampire? Is he actually just a really great method actor, or is he a fucking vampire, right? And so with this view of this bottle of blood, you're like, oh, okay, he's actually a vampire. So then my question was like, what? I understand we find out that Myrna found him in the cave and all that, but what power does he hold over Max Schreck? Like, because he's very old. He talks about being very old and not being able to make other vampires, and he remembers that possibly he never was able to make other vampires. We can't remember now, but he's still powerful and he still kills people in the end. So it's like the only thing that Murnau has over Shrek is that he promises him if he plays the vampire in his movie, he will give him a woman.
Mhm.
So we're to assume that maybe he shows him a picture of Greta Schroeder, oh yeah, now that I'm talking about it, I think that's the case because in one scene where Wangenheim takes out the necklace and shows him the picture of her, he recognizes her. So I was thinking, how does he know who she is? But that's probably why, because Murnau showed him a picture of Greta and said, you can have this woman if at the end of my movie, if you come and play the vampire role, which is fucked up. Like he was willing to sacrifice anybody to make his movie.
Yeah, because nothing really matters other than what's in the frame. So
In the
everything
frame.
else is just sort of grist to the mill as far as he's concerned. And to heck with heck with the actual actor, because they're just sort of delivery systems for um, the content that's going to be within the frame that he's looking at. So they're
Yeah.
really throwaways to him. And so one of the things that I started wondering is who's the real vampire here, or who's the movie postulating as the real vampire? Um, and does that include Murnau? And I think absolutely it does. Absolutely. And I mean, because early
Yeah.
on, we've got Greta saying something to the effect of when she's being filmed by Murnau, she's pointing to the camera, that new technology, and she says something like, that thing, meaning the camera, takes away my life, and performing before the audience in the theater, that gives me life. And so I think that the camera itself becomes almost like this visual vampire, where sucking up lives into it. I mean,
Yeah.
literally at the end of the film, where we've got where we see Orlok shriveling into decaying film at the very end, because essentially he's been eaten by the film.
Right. Oh, that's and to your point, also, it's who is there. I mean, there's more than one monster. I mean, Shrek isn't the only monster here. Murnau in the movie, not in real life, because in real life, like you said, it was said that he was a really nice person, but in the movie, Murnau is also a monster, right? Because he's
Yeah.
sacrificing human lives to make his quote unquote artwork, and so that's very monstrous. So yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that's a great point.
Well, and I love the fact that I love the fact that that's that goes so much to that sort of tension that we often see, especially with directors like Kubrick or like Bertolucci, or God help us, Harvey Weinstein, um,
Mm.
where um, where people just more or less get sacrificed for the art or for the content or for the product, and and you do. I mean, the exchange is that you do get to be part of that sort of that sort of eternal reality that film offers you, but obviously at what cost? I mean, it preserves that eternal life, but kind of like a vampire, it freezes you in time so that you're both eternal but also static. You kind of exist within the frame, but is that genuinely existing? I mean, especially because, like you were pointing out earlier, how Stoker's wife Florence petitioned to have all the copies of this movie destroyed. So, like, how eternal is film anyway? And I'm, certainly something that Elias Marriage was aware of when he's making this, is that film's not exactly as eternal as film Murnau is assuming that it is, or pretending it is.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So in the movie, so somebody's brought in the bottle of blood, and then he says, "I feed the way old men pee, sometimes all at once, sometimes drop by drop. And
Wasn't that
I
a great?
great line, but also he's warning Murnau, right? Because he's saying, I'm going to be picking off your cast members one by one,
Mhm.
your crew members one by one. Because he's saying, sometimes I'm okay with eating or feeding little by little, but sometimes I like to gorge myself. And it's probably around that time where I'm going to be gorging myself. So it was a pretty good line going back and kind of thinking about it, that he was kind of warning him, because Murnau believes he has power over Shrek, but doesn't really, I mean, he does and he doesn't, right? But that's one of the funny parts in an exchange that comes a little bit later, and we talked about it a little bit. So I kind of want to wait for that, but just that the power dynamic that Murnau thinks he has over Shrek is just funny. Um, so back in the filming of the movie, they're at the scene where the actor Wangenheim is kind of it's that famous scene where he's showing him the contract that Dracula's supposed to be signing, or Nosferatu, or whatever. It's all meta and getting mixed up in my head. But so we're at that scene, and Murnau is directing the scene, and he's trying to get him to cut himself so that Orlok can see the blood, right? He's like, look at me, look at the camera, but continue to bring the knife towards yourself while you're cutting this piece of bread. Like that whole scene, he's like, look at the bread and grab the knife, right? Like that was out of Nosferatu too. Like it's just so great. But Murnau he's a monster. He's a dick for like having him cut himself so that Shrek will attack the actor. It's he's trying to keep it's all getting stuck in my head. He's trying to keep Shrek under wraps, but then he like throws blood in his face and expects him not to react. He definitely wanted a reaction there.
Oh, 100%. And that again, that sort of directorial manipulation
Right.
of
Manipulation.
of the actor with the scene, and how do we get them to genuinely react. I thought was amazingly well done, and creepy, and messed up and cool at the same time. Um, and again, props, um, props to being able to pull that off so well.
Yeah. And then so kind of he kind of attacks him, but we also didn't mention that in between this, he's already Shrek has attacked one of the cameramen, and that guy is like kind of getting sick and will eventually die and have to be replaced. But here he attacks the actor, but I don't believe he bites him because the actor doesn't die. He's just kind of sucking the blood, I believe. But
Yeah.
everybody leaves, and then it's kind of funny. Shrek starts looking at the cameras and like starts manipulating them, and like he starts basically doing hand puppets with the shadows. And I was thinking, oh, this is quite literally the shadow of the vampire. And then
Ah,
so we get the title of the movie, and then he also gets to see footage of a sunrise, which is something that he had, which was his big wish for himself, and so he got to see it.
that moment is so poignant, because it's the first time that he's seen the sun in probably hundreds of years, and it's not even the real sun. It's this representation of the sun that he's seeing through the lens of the camera, this remove. And so we're seeing him seeing the sun, and so we're sort of at even more of a remove than he is. And so, I mean, again, Shadow of the Vampire very much, because this is kind of like being in Plato's cave. I mean, and the vampire's cave too.
Right. So then we get this scene that you alluded to a bit in the beginning, and is one of my favorite scenes. Is Murnau confronts Shrek in his cave and say, "How dare you interrupt the making of my movie? How dare you attack my cameraman, who is now like falling really ill and is probably at this point dead?" He's like, why him? Why not the script girl? I was like, Jesus, okay.
There we
So,
go.
yeah. At first, it was like, I need all my crew. They're all important. Don't interrupt my work. And then he's like, okay, just have the script girl. And then Shrek says in his like with his fingers, like with those claws, he's like, I don't think we need the writer any longer. I was like, man, it's
Oh, and
so
boy, did
fucking
that
funny.
have did that not feel like just like a total in film in joke jab at like that relationship between directors and writers and producers and actors? I mean, to me, it totally felt like an in joke,
Yeah.
especially in light of the current strike. And were they having a strike with the writers around 2000 when this film was made? Do I remember that right?
The last strike before this current one, I believe, was like in 2008.
Oh, okay,
Uh,
okay, a little bit.
and then I don't know what the one was before that one. Um, but yeah, so then at one point he's like, "Fine, just you eat the writer," and he's like, like I said, he believes he has this power, but inch by inch and inch by inch, he's losing it. And at one point, it's later on after another one of these yelling matches, um, Max Shrek actually says at one point, like, "You actually believe that you're still in charge of this movie?" And I was like, "Oh
Mm-hmm.
fuck!" Like, you haven't been in charge this whole time. The minute you stepped into that cave, you made a deal with the devil and you fucked yourself and everybody else.
Yeah, because he's a golem. I mean, he's this creature that you call forth from into life, but you just don't have that control over him at all. He's got control over you ultimately, and it's that Faustian bargain.
Yeah. And then he threatens him, Murnoff threatens him, and um, uh, Shrek was like, "Tell me how you would harm me, even I don't know how I would harm myself." And so again, he's like, "You you can't mess with me." Little does he know, later on in the film, obviously something happens, but at this point he feels um like he can't be harmed, like he is the one in the power. Um, so then later on we get Murnau has to leave because his cameraman has been killed. And I love how he's playing it off. He's like, no, he's just sick. I'm going to drop him off at the hospital. This fucker's not never making it to a hospital. Murnau has
No.
completely lost the plot and is like going to basically like uh, make the body disappear and go find somebody else. While that's happening, while he's like in Berlin, I believe, or something like that, kind of filming has stopped for a bit, and everybody's like around a fire, and um, Shrek comes, and I'm like, oh man, he just wanted to be one of the guys. He just came to like like talk shit around a fire, and I just thought that was again part of the campiness of this movie is just like seeing Max Shrek, who is a literal vampire, sitting around a fire with people who think he's an actor, and they're asking him about his acting method and stuff about him. So whenever they're asking him questions, he's answering truthfully, and they think that he's really in character.
I was saying essentially that this is that moment of human interaction where he's connecting with these people that who think that he's an actor, but he's pretending on multiple levels to be a human and to re-engage with that part of himself that he probably hasn't been in hundreds of years. And I think part of him does kind of just want to hang out with the guys at the fire and just shoot the shit and have a good time. And that pathos is delightful. Actually, I think Defoe does such a good job
Yeah.
making us care about this
And then so around the fire, they start asking him questions about his, quote unquote character. And he says, they ask like, how long have you been a vampire? When did you, or when were you born, sort of stuff. And he's like, I can't recall, I can't remember. And they're like, oh, come on, like a real actor wouldn't just say, I can't recall, I can't remember. And then he does go into about like how he read Dracula and everything that you mentioned earlier. They ask him how he became a vampire, and he said that woman made him a vampire, which is a subplot that we talked about earlier. And then out of nowhere, while they're talking and they're drinking, he's just like taking chugs of a bottle of vodka or schnapps. I think it's schnapps. They say schnapps. He just grabs a bat out of thin air and tears its head off and starts drinking its blood. I'm like, okay, Ozzy. And then the only thing that they can think of to say when they see him do that is they're so awed by this that they say the German theater really needs him. They're like, what an actor. It's like, okay.
Well, it's such a metal moment, man. It's like, give me that bat.
Yeah. So then so Max is drunk and he like tries to walk away and take the bottle with him. They grab the bottle away from him. But then that you're right. He has said one of his actor demands is that he's not going on a ship anywhere. And Murnau is like, what are you talking about? We need to get to this island where we're filming your death scene. And he's like, well, I'm not going by ship. I can go by air. And so Murnau's going to fly him over there. But in the meantime, they've built kind of like a scale, like a 1/4 scale replica of the ship on the grounds of where they're shooting right now. And so he goes and attacks one of the crew members that's kind of setting up that ship. This little scene, it was very quick. This seemed more like an afterthought. They didn't really put a lot into it, and it wasn't very scary. It's just like, okay, he needs to kill somebody while he's drunk. And this person was just an extra. Like, I don't even know who they were in the context of the filming of the movie, you know? So this felt a bit like not as tight as everything else in the movie for me.
Yeah, I think if they could have lost something, that would have been one to lose for the reasons that you're bringing up, which is that we don't have a lot invested in this particular crewman. It does reinforce the idea that he's like picking off the members of the crew bit by bit. I mean, so it goes to that because I think like at the very beginning we're presented with this whole sort of pantheon of filmmakers with Murnau, of course, in the center. And bit by bit, it becomes like one guy in the camera. I mean, so it's part of the body count. But other than that, which I think we could lose because I think we're aware that there's a body count that our numbers are shrinking. I agree with you. If they were going to put something on the cutting room floor, if they needed to do that, I think that's one place that they could have.
Yeah. So then we finally get some Cary Elwes. We always need more Cary Elwes in our lives. And he shows up like a fucking rock star, comes in on an airplane, like immediately deboards and just starts shooting right away. Like he's their new cameraman, you know. It's great. He's setting up a shot, and you know, films the shot that he needs. I think he like shoots the gun in the air to get the reaction that he wants from the townsfolk who are not actors and actually townsfolk. So, and then later on in the scene, he's shooting with Shrek, and he goes down. He introduces himself, and he's like, you know, have you read Plato? And Shrek was like, read him. I knew him. And, like, okay. Right. And then Cary Elwes' his character. I can't continue to call him Cary Elwes, but his character is Wagner. A lot of German names, obviously. So Wagner says, okay, well, you know what he says? Like, the illusion is the shadow on the wall, and that's supposed to help Shrek play the part of the character. And then we get the kind of iconic shot of Nosferatu coming out of his coffin, which is that one where it's like do you know what I'm talking about? Where he kind of rises like no human should be able to do so. And you see the behind the scenes of that is they just propped him up with like some sort of mechanism that brought him up very slowly. I kind of like that because I was thinking while I was watching it, because he's an actual vampire, they're going to show him doing that really. But I like that. No, it was just a special effects sort of thing. I like that about that.
Well, it's a great special effect. I mean, it's the even in the original, the original film, the actual actor Max Shrek moves with this sort of weird stiffness through his upper body, especially on his shoulders. So he doesn't move like a human does. And I think Defoe does a great job of capturing that. And then that scene, again, showing the sort of movie magic behind some of, like that iconic, rise from the coffin type of thing. I think those work and talk together so beautifully, because and it emphasizes the creepiness, because you kind of do expect, like, is he going to do that just on his own? But no, it's movie magic, and so it goes with that comedy as well.
Right. Yeah, it was great. So then we get this next scene again where Murnau's kind of confronting Shrek about killing more crew members. And this is where he's like yelling at him, and he's like basically says something along the lines of, "You will not interfere with my picture any longer." And this is when Shrek says, "This is hardly your picture any longer." And it's great. And then
Yeah.
Murnau gets so angry that he attacks Shrek and starts choking him. And this is when like he fucked around and found out, because the look Shrek gives him, that
He's just amused.
yes, yeah, like that bug-eyed um Willem Dafoe look, but with the creepy oh man, looks so fucking good. But and then so Shrek gives him this crazy look, and then Murnau like sees it. He's like, "Oh fuck, I've gone too far," and like runs out of the out of the cave. And then any other movie, it would end there, or we would have the character looking off camera, right? But in this movie, he looks directly into the camera, and it's so fucking camp. It's amazing. I was like, oh, did this man just look me in my eyes and like give a sort of like a wink wink sort of thing? Loved it. Absolutely loved it.
Well, I mean, and there's that meta business again in that camp thing, because you've got, with camp. It's been years since I read Susan Sontag's essay on it, but I think that there's always that notion of there being that wink at the audience, like the audience, ideally for something that's camp, is kind of in on that joke, and boy, do I think that we really see that here.
Yeah, masterfully so. Yeah. So at this point, the crew is starting to talk. People are missing, and they're starting to say, "Hey, something's fucking happening." And so Heinrich tells them they get drunk one night, and he kind of leads them to where Max is sleeping, and he shows them that he's sleeping in a coffin. And they're like, Heinrich is like, he's a vampire, but nobody believes him. In fact, the producer's like, I'm the producer. If he were a vampire, don't you think I would know? And so obviously he didn't know. So they don't believe him. They end up leaving, and Shrek ends up following Henrik home. But it's the funniest thing, because he has no chill. He's stomping around like he doesn't understand the concept of stalking, quote unquote, being quiet, because you could like hear him stomping through these streets of Czechoslovakia at night where everything's echoing. So I kind of love that part. And then we get back to the hotel where everybody's staying, and her name, Greta is like yelling. We're not sure what's happening. They go in there and they find out that she's on drugs. She's on morphine. And they kind of calm her down, tell everybody to go back to bed. And at that point, Shrek has come into the hotel, and he's like goes directly to her room. And I'm thinking, oh no, something bad gonna happen. Please don't do it. Please don't do it. Luckily, the door is locked, which is so good. But it's so creepy, because he then goes and tries everybody else's door, and they're all locked. But if you hadn't locked your damn door at night, you would have been a victim of Max Shrek. And it's so fucking creepy. I don't know. What did you think of that part?
I love that. I love that tension between, like, the sort of humor of these people have locked their doors, and this vampire just can't get in because they've locked the doors, or there's kind
Yeah.
of the equivalent of a do not disturb sign, and they haven't invited the vampire in. But I also, and so here he is, he's sitting sort of powerless outside these three doors, sort of awkwardly standing there. But at the same time, too, yeah, Greta would be toast if he were actually to be let in, because you can sense obviously that his sort of vampire appetite is growing here, and he's becoming more and more of an explicit threat. Not because he's narrowed it down from like the crew members and the cinematographer, and now there's just only a few more people left, and one of them is Myrna. And so, Myrna better watch his back. We obviously know, and if he doesn't, he's being foolish.
Yeah. And then so he kind of goes from room to room. He can't get in, and then we see Heinrich come up. Or I believe it's Heinrich. Might be somebody else, but I believe it's Heinrich. And Heinrich's like, "Can I help you?" Because he sees this guy trying to get into people's doors, and then he turns his back on him, which was his mistake. And then that scene ends, and we know that Heinrich ends up disappearing and is killed. But now we're in Murnau's room. They're trying to knock the door down because he's not answering. They hear him in there, and so they kind of break the door in, and they see that he's high on drugs, which they say laudanum. So I looked laudanum because I wasn't sure what it was, but it's an opium tincture that was widely used in the 19th century as a painkiller or a sleeping aid, but it was highly addictive, leading to many of its users forming a drug addiction. So,
big time. This is like the OxyContin of the late 1800s.
yeah, and I'm sure. So I'm sure that perhaps some of the way that Murnau is acting here is probably due to that addiction, right? As far as willing to sacrifice people for his movie and all that sort of stuff. So he's high on this drug, and he's basically he spills. He tells him everything. He tells him that that Shrek isn't an actor. He's actually a real life vampire. They ask him where he found them or found him, and he says that he found him in a book about despotic Slovakian rulers that was given to him by a woman. Was that
There we go.
the woman from earlier from the cabaret? The Slovakian rulers were reputed to be vampires. And then he forgot about it. But then he read Dracula and wanted to film Dracula. And so he was scouting locations. He remembered about this book. So he read the book, and while he was scouting out locations in Czechoslovakia, he came upon Max Schreck living in the old monastery. And he offered him everlasting life, which is film. And then he also offered him Greta. And that's how Max Schreck came to be in the movie. So
and such a vampiristic offer, isn't it? I offer you eternal life. I offer you victims that are living. And here Murnau himself is playing the vampire to a vampire.
right, exactly. So now everybody knows. Well, now no, they failed to mention it to Greta, but everybody else knows, right? And so they have to film this death scene, this last scene on the island. So the way they get Shrek onto the island is they fly him and his coffin to the island. And I'm thinking, wait, so that this man is Dracula, or sorry, this man is a vampire. You can leave right now. You can warn Greta, but you decide to go through with it. Let's shoot this scene. I don't know, man.
She's that not so final girl.
Yeah, exactly. So they're filming the scene. They start setting up for the scene, and Greta immediately feels that the vibes are off because he's stalking her around the room, and she can feel that. Like, how does this like? I can't imagine being in her position where this woman is on an island by herself, surrounded by men, and one is like actively stalking her.
Isn't he wearing her like the locket with her image um, as Jonathan Harker's fiance around his neck this whole time too, like in the last part of the movie.
Oh,
That's
he
I
might
think I
be.
recall. Yeah, I think he is, which is even creepier because it's like you're kind of being like Stockley fanboy, you know.
Yeah. And so I feel bad for her. And then what happens next to her? I cannot believe what they fucking do. But she's very uncomfortable. Um, they tell her Myrna at one point says, as they say, relax and the vampire will do all the
Oh,
work.
oh,
I'm like, wait a
oh,
minute.
oh.
Who says that? How is that a saying? And also that's a terrible thing to say, you know. Um, and then she this is where she sees that he has no reflection. He casts no reflection in the mirror, and she kind of loses it and starts yelling. And then what do they do? Instead of like saving her or explaining to her what's happening, bringing her in on the situation or anything, they drug her.
Yep, they
That's
get that forced compliance because she's quote unquote crazy. And I mean, I think I mean, unfortunately, God knows in real life, in film, even if we take that, little slice of life, we certainly see that with the treatment of people like Maria Schneider in Last Tango or Shelley Duvall in The Shining, where, or even Friedkin with the actress in The Exorcist, certainly Blair, um, and and essentially their objections are just overridden, and they're treated as essentially that forced female obedience and passivity because they're objecting to this treatment that's going on, and they get that forcible compliance and her silence in this scene, and it's deeply disturbing. I think it's meant to, and it certainly hits that mark.
it's terrible what they do. If you think about it, it's terrible if they were just filming a movie. But it's a
Mm.
next level of terror that they're filming a movie and she is in literal danger for her life with a vampire that actively wants to consume her, you know.
Yeah, so like this turns into like a snuff film.
I have it. I said now it's a snuff film. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. And so, but at this point, Max Schreck is all worked up, like he's like begging to have her now. And Murnau is like, no, we need to film the scene. We need to film the scene. And Dafoe is so fucking good here because you can feel the yearning that he has, like this desire to consume her, and everything in his power he's doing to hold that back. It's just so good. And so he's trying to Murnau's directing the scene, like he's basically saying look at telling Shrek to look at her wantingly, and like, or I guess you've had her already and stuff like that. And then he tells shoot, what is her name? Sorry.
Greta?
Greta. Yeah,
No.
he tells Greta to like reach for the stake that
Oh,
she has in her close to her hands. And then like in the movie Nosferatu, at this point is when Nosferatu will die because of the sun. But obviously, that doesn't happen here. They're just like play acting that it happens, right? But like the directions that Murnau is giving, he's like, okay, and now you die, you fucking
oh.
bastard vampire pig. And it's like, okay, you've been holding this back for a bit, and now you can actually say how you feel about him. But so then he quote unquote dies in the movie. Then now, like supposedly they stopped filming, and they actually let him attack her. And I was
Oh,
so, because we have Carrie Elwes here who like plays the. I thought he was going to be the star. He was going to step in, or I thought Murnau had some great plan to be like, oh, actually, we're just going to kill you, and like the shade comes up and then he gets killed by the sun, which happens a little bit, but it doesn't happen before she gets killed. And I was so fucking blown away by this. How did you feel when you saw that they actually, like, he actually killed her?
I was just shaking my head. I was just shaking my head, going, "Yep, yep, yep," because ultimately this is that, sort of complicit acts that, like you were pointing out with earlier when you mentioned Greta's essential isolation. She's on an island. She's by herself, and I think too, we're talking about her career for one thing, and also her sense of reality. Is this really an act? And so I think that indeterminacy can really lead you to say to go down farther into that dark path in the woods than you would normally go. I mean, if you think that it's all just a game, then you don't have to take it really super seriously. And I think that by the time that she understands the degree of her entrapment, it is literally too late as we see that needle go into her vein, and we see her lose almost all conscious response other than, sort of the like heavy movements from deep sleep. So she's obviously not able to defend herself. And so, and one of the things that the movie does for the viewer is I think it makes us aware of ourselves as viewers. To what degree are we also implicated in this act? Because we're watching her, and she's
Yeah.
the one who's experiencing this real moment.
Yeah, it's a great point. And also I feel like it's a commentary, if we're talking about the commentary that they're making about behind the scenes, how actors and directors interact and like demands and stuff like that. I believe it might also be a commentary on the studio system that chews up and spits out specifically women, women actors. Like you were talking about, like Harvey Weinstein, but there's so many other examples of that where they would take these young women actresses and kind of like put them in the system and then spit them out when they got quote unquote too old, or they talked back or didn't want to do something, and they would just spit them out of the system. And that's kind of what happened, what Murnau is doing to her here. It's like she is only useful to me as a tool, and that's it. And I'm using her as such, and then don't really care what happens to her afterwards. It's like they're saying so much with by showing so little. I don't know. I really, that's the thing I love about horror movies, that people think it's just silly stuff, blood stuff, but no, they're actually making commentary on things.
Well, and I mean, I think about all the Hollywood actresses who dropped off the map because they were quote unquote difficult, like
Right.
Sean Young or Mira Sorvino, or I don't know, that whole roster of folks in the Me Too movement whose careers were deeply damaged because they spoke up against the abuse that they were experiencing. And I remember a comment. I'll never forget hearing at least a comment that's attributed to Marilyn Monroe, where she finally became a star. And one of the things that she was walking around talking with a friend of hers, and the friend was saying, "Well, it must be great to be a star." And she said, "Yeah, I'm really glad I don't have to just give a bunch of blowjobs anymore."
Hmm.
And I'm thinking, wow, damn. And that's Marilyn Monroe. So
Yeah.
you know that it's for pretty much everybody else down the line.
Yeah. It's terrible. Terrible history of Hollywood that almost assuredly still happening now. Hopefully people are being called out on their bullshit and being hopefully, it's not, it's just a terrible thing, and hopefully people aren't, it's not happening to them. But unfortunately, like with the reality of power dynamics in any industry, terrible people take advantage of those power dynamics.
Yeah, I
But
totally agree.
so that's, but I like that this movie's trying to say something about that, even if it's not exactly what the director or the writer was trying to say. That's how I'm interpreting it. And once you put out, like I was saying, once you put art out into the world, people interpret it the way they're going to interpret it, and that's just kind of how I interpreted it. Um, but so he attacks her and just like sucking her blood, and they're filming that again. Don't stop it. And then the next scene we see, he's looking directly at us, eyes wide open, having fallen asleep from drinking her blood. And this is very obviously like a sign of like falling asleep after sex, you know?
Mm.
So this was so she was, not only was she murdered, she was assaulted, right?
Yeah.
She was sexually assaulted, and you know that it's terrible. But I'm struggling to find a way to say it's terrible, but the shot is amazing, right? Like it's a great shot, right? But it's terrible subject matter. So so then they finally decide to do something. They're in a cave. I'm not quite sure. Maybe you could help out with what's happening here, but they're kind of like in a cave, and they have like this door that's on chains, and they need to I think Murnau drops the door so that so Max can't escape, and they're going to kill him. And Wagner, right? Is it Wagner? Yeah, Cary was Wagner. Wagner is going to try to kill him, and he brings out a gun and shoots him 3 times. Obviously, that does nothing. Wagner is killed, and then there's another person that's killed. And so, like, Murnau, while these people are getting killed, is still filming, of course, right?
Mm-hmm.
He
Yep, yep,
continues to
yep.
film. Then we hear this pounding at the door after he kind of attacks Greta again and is feeding off her again. And Murnau's just like yelling at him, like, moon chaser, blasphemer. And then the people are pounding to be let in. I believe it's the townspeople, and they finally raise the door to get in there. And that's when the sun comes up, and obviously the sun and vampires don't mix, and Shrek ends up being killed by being exposed to the sun. And it's a beautiful, it's a wonderful death scene that's shot wonderfully, and the film melts, which is kind of cool. And this is where I said, like, now it's a snuff film, kind of like you were saying earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have those great closing words to end the movie. Murnau says, I think we have it. And then the movie fades to black, and then that's the end of the movie.
It's a great mic drop of a last line. It really is, so it's brilliant. And like watching the original Nosferatu, in the original, Count Orlok like fades out, he disappears, like, and like he's standing there, and then there's sort of like he gets fainter, and then we don't see him. But in this, I love that we don't see that. We just see him through the lens of the camera, because now we are Murnau. We're from his perspective, and we just see him burn. We see the only remnant of him, which is the film, burning up, like he himself is doing in quote unquote real life, as the sun hits him. And again, we have that sort of meta-ness. What we're seeing on film is that reality. And I love that we don't see what happens to movie Orlok except through that medium of the camera's lens.
Yeah.
So I'm amazed. I mean, at the beginning of this podcast episode, you mentioned something that really surprised me a lot, which is that that Elias Merritt really doesn't have a long resume in terms of like feature filmmaking, and I'm shocked because this is really a masterful work.
Yeah, agreed. I thought it was so good. After I saw the movie, I was like, while I was doing research, I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go see what else this guy has done. So I
Yeah.
can, and he's only done one other movie besides some shorts, and it's really surprising. And I just don't know why. Maybe, I got to look into him a bit more, but I would love to get to see him get an opportunity to do some more stuff, because he did an amazing job with this movie could have gone very terribly, but it's like I was saying before, it straddles the line between horror and comedy and camp and dramatic realism. I don't know, it's absolutely great. But we can kind of roll into rating the film, and what we do here is we rate the movie out of 5 upside down crosses. So if you could just give me your rating based on 5 upside down crosses, and it could be half crosses, whatever the case may be, and it's just what you feel at this time. Like for me, I originally gave this movie a different rating when I saw it years ago, having watched it for the for the podcast today, I have a different rating. So it just really depends on how you're feeling about the movie today.
Well, it's funny. I initially, like the first time through, I might have rated it lower than I would. I'm going to give it a 4.75 crosses. The 7.5 is just because I feel like there were some parts that they didn't follow up on. But you pointed out, like the scene in the cabaret where he's talking, which they were going to make more of a thing. And then the scene on the ship, which I think that they probably could have shaken off without a whole lot of loss. Um, and that's it. I mean, and I'm trying to find stuff that I didn't think served the story all that much. It didn't just detract from it particularly to the point where it was a problem. I'm just trying to be super fair. But the more that I thought about this film, and especially that interaction between it and Nosferatu, because one of the questions in my mind was, other than the really cool concept of maybe Max Schreck as a vampire, which is a great elevator pitch right there. I mean, it's fantastic. Could they have done that with any other movie like Fritz Lang's M or Cabinet of Dr. Caligari? I mean, some of these real classics. And no, they couldn't have, because this film is absolutely saying that there's an intimate relationship between film and vampirism, that it is a vampiristic medium. And so the more I looked at it, honestly, the better it got, and the more I respected what everybody was doing at every level. So I would say 4.75, and that's only because I'm trying to be harsh and fair.
Okay. Well, that's great. I agree with you. I really, really enjoyed this movie. And you know what? We didn't even talk about the fact that Nosferatu, the vampire, the actual movie, not the movie that they're talking about, but the actual movie came out in 1922, is 101 years old.
Oh,
And
wow.
you saw it as a, the silent film, and you were affected by it. You liked it. It's 101 years old. And I believe either this year or next year, they're coming out with a remake of Nosferatu,
Oh,
directed
are they?
by directed by Robert Eggers, and starring,
Oh, perfect. Mwah, chef's kiss.
yeah, and it's starring the guy that you referenced earlier, the glitter vampire. He was in the Lighthouse.
Robert Pattinson.
Robert Eggers, or yeah, Robert Pattinson, yeah, starring him. So
Sweet.
yeah, 2024, I believe
Oh,
it's coming out. So, but I just wanted to say that. So I said that to say that this movie is still, or Nosferatu is still relevant over 100 years later, and they're making movies about the making of the movie, which is this movie that's so meta and it's so campy and it's so funny and horrific, and the directing and the act, I just loved all of it. So for me, I'm at 4.5 upside down crosses. Just I don't know why nobody talks about this movie as much as they should. Like, it doesn't seem that it gets the recognition, and maybe that's just in my circles. I'm not sure, but people need to be talking about it because it's so good.
honestly, I think it's that it hasn't really been available as on
That's true.
streaming services. I mean, like if you're a horror movie fan, you probably were on Shudder, and you're probably looking at original Nosferatu or the Kinski Nosferatu, and certainly obviously um, the Gary Oldman, Francis Ford Coppola, Dracula, and and the Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee, all those. But because Shadow of the Vampire isn't streamable, it's hard to get. Um, I bet that's a massive reason why folks haven't, why it's never really come up on folks' radar, and that's a shame because my God,
Yeah,
it's
I
fantastic.
I agree. Great. So actually, RA, what one thing that we do before we end the show also is that I give you a suggestion of a movie in a similar vein to Shadow of the Vampire, and then I ask for a recommendation from you. Okay, all right. So the movie that I would recommend to you in a similar vein to Shadow of the Vampire, and seeing as how you've already seen the original Nosferatu 1922 version, I would recommend Nosferatu the Vampire from 1979, directed by Werner Herzog and starring Klaus Kinski and Isabella Gianni, who I absolutely adore. Have you seen Possession with Isabella Gianni?
I have not.
Okay.
I the last oh, I'm trying to think about what the last Johnny film that I saw was, and I'm drawing a blank. I'm so sorry, but she's
No
great.
worries. Yeah, I love
Perfect.
Isabella Gianni. That's a recommendation, just like an all-time recommendation for me when I talk to somebody. If you haven't seen Possession, it's absolutely amazing. And it's starring Sam Neill and Isabella Gianni, and she's amazing in it. But outside of that, the recommendation for this particular movie is Nosferatu the Vampire from 1979. So that's my recommendation to you. Do you have a recommendation for me?
I absolutely do. You'll no doubt have seen this film, but I don't know if you've seen it sort of through the lens, no pun intended, of looking at it sort of as in dialogue with Shadow of the Vampire, and that's Hitchcock's Vertigo. You mentioned that sort of line of transmission uh, from Murnau to Herzog, or excuse me, from Murnau to Hitchcock. And where I think Vertigo really fits is that it's also about that idea of performance, of framing. If it isn't in that frame, it doesn't exist, because we've got Scotty, this detective who's sort of lost his mojo after he's failed to catch this burglar guy, and he gets conned, as we find out, into um, being a private detective stalking the wife of this financier. Her name is Madeline Elster, and it turns out that Scotty starts remaking um, this after Madeline Elster dies. Scotty starts remaking this woman that he thinks is completely different into this film, this sort of remembered artistic version of Madeline. And in both movies, we've got this idea of making this woman into someone who embodies that desire. And ultimately, in both movies, we've got both of them, both the female characters, being a victim of that sort of directorial shaping.
Okay.
And and I think that many of us are both talking about that issue of manipulating reality, shaping reality, um, and of course, at what expense?
I love that. I definitely have seen Vertigo. I haven't seen it through that lens, and it's been a long time since I've seen it. So I would definitely love to rewatch it through the lens that you just mentioned. So that's great. I love that very much. So that's the end of the show, RA. I wanted to thank you so much for being on. I had a blast talking about everything with the Shadow of the Vampire and F.W. Murnau and Willem Dafoe. So if you could please let everybody know how they could follow you, how they could support your work, where they can buy your stuff, all that sort of stuff, how they can follow you on social medias, everything.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, because I've loved watching this movie, and for the reasons that I think we talked about, it's not one that was really on my radar, and so I just had a great time delving into Shadow of the Vampire, Nosferatu, and looking at expressionism and how those work together. It was a genuine pleasure for me, and then to be able to talk about it with you, because you've seen it and you're very super knowledgeable about film. And again, that was just a pleasure. But to
Thank you.
answer your other question, I'm on the artist formerly known as Twitter, and also on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads, um, and Goodreads, and if you want to look me up on any of those, there's a link to my website. So again, it's a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And so is it just R.A. Busby on all socials?
Yeah, I try
Okay.
to keep it really super consistent, easy to find, the whole bit.
Okay, great. Yeah, this has been such a blast. We RA and I are going to continue our conversation on the Sunday School Sessions, which is the Patreon exclusive show. If you'd like to support the show, patreon.com/myhorrorconfessional, where we'll have this show plus a bunch of other content, Patreon exclusive content like my 2K Confessional, which is the show that I do with Anthony Jerome M, and just a bunch of other stuff. So if that's something you're interested in doing, please do so. Anyway, thank you for listening, and we will talk to you guys next week. Bye.